This is Nick Redding, and you're listening to PreserveCast, a podcast with a worldwide listenership that explores the broad world of preservation from every angle, from drones to mudlarking and everything in between. Now, let's get preserving. There's perhaps no author or person who's made more of an impact on the modern notion of Christmas than Charles Dickens. The famed author is now almost synonymous with Christmas, and his legendary work, A Christmas Carol, has sold millions of copies and has been turned into no fewer than 135 different movies. With this legendary success, how best to tell his story? That's the subject of today's PreserveCast, a deep dive into the legacy and story of Dickens with Dr. Cindy Sughrue, the director of the Charles Dickens Museum. I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. Charles Dickens, A Christmas Carol. This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast. Today, we're excited to be joined, perfect time of the year to do this, by Dr. Cindy Sughrue, who is the director of the Charles Dickens Museum in merry old England, coming to us all the way from across the pond, and excited to be having this conversation this time of the year, which we were just saying before we hit record, we've definitely hit the busy season for the Charles Dickens Museum. But before we dive into the work of the Dickens Museum and preserving that legacy, Cindy, it'd be interesting just to kind of get to know you a little bit. Where'd you grow up? What put you on the path to leading this, unique museum? And was Dickens something you were always a fan of? And talk to us a little bit about your background.
Great. Well, there are a few dots to connect here. I was actually born in Boston, Massachusetts, and I grew up in the Boston area. But you wouldn't necessarily know this from my accent, which is predominantly Scottish. I lived in Scotland for 30 years before relocating back to London 6 years ago. But growing up in New England, I was surrounded by historic houses. The first one I can remember visiting was Orchard House, the home of Louisa May Alcott. And I've always been drawn to historic places. So here in England, we're immersed in it, whether it's a big monument like Stonehenge or a rather modest historic house like the Charles Dickens Museum. It was perhaps, that sense of being connected to physical history in those sort of writers or artist houses that sort of first got me thinking about the museum here in a different way. But growing up in New England was part of that, being connected into a sort of historical cultural landscape. So really, perhaps the greatest influence on my journey to Dickens, and one I didn't see at the time, was my brilliant high school English teacher, a man called Neil Murphy. And he set us an incredibly challenging but brilliant reading list of a classic text each week. So we had to get through these at the rate of knots. But I was introduced to Dickens and a number of other writers in a really meaningful way. And it was in school that I started to read Dickens differently. I remember always being aware, as most people are, of A Christmas Carol. It was part of our regular family Christmas tradition. It's almost in my bones, my DNA. But in high school, reading Dickens under the sort of inspirational leadership of a great English teacher introduced me to not only the lyricism of how Dickens writes, but even in the most tragic moments, how funny he is. He's such a funny writer. So there was a lot of joy I got out of learning Dickens. And of course, life sometimes takes you in different directions. And I ended up getting a scholarship to come to the UK in the 1980s to do a PhD in ethnochoreology, which is anthropology of dance. And I worked in the cultural sector after completing that, did everything from running a contemporary art gallery to a national ballet company. But when this job came up 6 years ago, it seemed to draw all sorts of different threads together for me at a time that I was keen to come back to London. So, yeah, I would have to say it really is the best job in the world. And it's something that can give you a sense of connecting with a writer in a really rich and full way. But also you have the pleasure of seeing hundreds of people come through the door every day or every week and see how fascinated they can become being in the place where Dickens lived and wrote, that sense of being connected to the sort of physical presence of a writer that's been gone a long time.
I mean, he's almost a larger than life character. I mean, we talk about Dickensian writing. It's almost like Dickens sort of like transcends himself. Like sometimes you forget that there's a person behind it, which is why I think it's so fascinating and so important to have the house that actually grounds him as a human being, not just this sort of voice behind the pen. But for someone who perhaps isn't familiar listening with Charles Dickens beyond maybe just A Christmas Carol, who was this man, and why is he still so beloved? Is it A Christmas Carol? Is it the whole collection of his work? Why almost 200 years later are we still talking about him, and is your life dedicated to running his museum?
Well, it's interesting because I wish I had a pithy answer to, who was Charles Dickens beyond A Christmas Carol. He certainly is remembered because of that, and that is something that is almost always the starting point for people with getting to know Dickens. But he really is considered the greatest Victorian novelist, and he achieved in his lifetime unprecedented popular appeal. He was an international celebrity as we would know them today, a real superstar. And this was because he was the first writer to really portray contemporary life and issues and writing about ordinary people. It wasn't middle and upper class people. It was ordinary people that many people could relate to for the first time. So we have these iconic characters that entered popular culture. But he was widely read or listened to and adapted for stage during his lifetime. Many of his novels received stage premieres before they were even completed. He wrote almost all his work in a serialized fashion. They'd come out in monthly or sometimes weekly installments. So very much like someone might watch, a serialized program, a soap opera, or indulge in a box set, Dickens was doing that active writing. And it's always fascinating when people come here to the museum and they immerse themselves in this extraordinary collection that we have, that they can see how much of real life was drawn into his work, and not just about buildings and places that people might still see in the urban landscape here in London today, but even the characters. So to give you an example, in Oliver Twist, there's a magistrate called Mr. Fagin, and Oliver is hauled up before him after being caught supposedly for pickpocketing. And Mr. Fagin was modelled on a real person at the time who was a magistrate in the very same magistrate's court that Dickens describes. And this real life character was called Alan Lang. So Mr. Lang becomes Mr. Fagin. And something we have in our collection, in our archive, is a letter that Dickens wrote to a friend of his who was the court reporter at this magistrate's court. And he says to his friend, Dickens, writing to his friend, says, I want to model a magistrate in my next installment of Oliver Twist on your Mr. Lang. And I know all about him and how notoriously harsh and cruel he is, but I've never set eyes on him. So could you smuggle me in one morning so I can see what he looks like? Because Dickens didn't want to just draw on a character. He wanted people to know exactly who these characters were. He wanted to be able to describe them and then thinly disguise them, because his work was not just to tell great stories, which of course he did. He also wanted to make very pointed social and political comment. And I think that's one of the other reasons why Dickens was not just popular in his day, but remains popular today, because he's talking about real issues that affect many people. And he does it with good humor, but also with deep understanding of human nature and with kindness and compassion and energy, and also with this incredible lyric way of writing. So, he embraced things that mattered to people then, and I think that's the same energy and connection that draws out that continued popularity today.
Yeah, and it's such an approachable text too. I think a lot of writing from the 19th century can be really dense and kind of hard to wade through. They sometimes wrote in a way that is unfamiliar to the modern mind or modern tongue, and Dickens seems to capture a little modernity in his writing. I mean, it's very clear and accessible, at least from my perspective, compared to some of his contemporaries, which I think probably accounts for why he's still so beloved, because it's easy to read. It's not impossible.
Absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right, because he wasn't an intellectual writer writing about upper-class people with highbrow concerns. He was writing about ordinary people and situations, and with that deep understanding of universal themes, what drives us, our hopes, our dreams, when we succeed, when we fail, and that sense of injustice. We've all suffered some type of injustice in our lives, and that real triumph over adversity. And so, I walk around London today and I see all sorts of Dickens characters. We're wearing different clothes, but we're the same people underneath it all. So, I think it's that real sense of a deep understanding of human nature and what drives and motivates us.
So let's talk a little bit about the museum. So when was it established? Where is it? How big's the team? And what's it like if somebody were to come and visit? What kind of experience would they get?
So the Dickens Museum is comprised of two Georgian townhouses that numbers 48 and 49 Doughty Street. And this is in the Bloomsbury area of central London. We're about a 10-minute walk from the British Museum, if that's a useful landmark. And 48 Doughty Street was the house where Dickens established himself as a writer in the late 1830s. He moved in at the age of 25. On the weekend, he was celebrating his first wedding anniversary with his wife, Catherine, and their first child, the first of 10 children, Charles Dickens Jr., young Charlie was only a matter of weeks old. And during the time he lived here, it was just 3 years, he went from an unknown writer writing under the pen name Boz to this international superstar, literally known the world over. So it was fascinating that in those 3 years, he did a phenomenal amount of work. He was finishing writing his first novel, Pickwick Papers. They went on to write Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby. He started working on Barnaby Rudge. He was editing a monthly magazine, Bentley's Miscellany. He edited the memoirs of Joseph Grimaldi, who's a famous Victorian clown, and wrote a number of short stories. He was writing still for newspapers, for editorial theatre reviews. Phenomenal what he was doing. And during the time he was here, he and Catherine had 2 more children, and expanded their social circle of friends quite dramatically. He became someone who moved across society, from politicians, statesmen, through to the greatest artists, writers, actors of the day. So they became this sort of young couple, trailblazing across London and becoming these really celebrity superstars, as we would know celebrities today. So in 48 Doughty Street, we have reinstated Dickens's house as it was when they lived here in the 1830s. And in 49, we have temporary exhibition spaces, research library and archive, various meeting spaces, cafe, shop, and so on. And the museum, you'd asked before about when it was established. We were formed in 1925, founded by the Dickens Fellowship, which is a worldwide association of people interested in Dickens, everyone from fans to eminent scholars. So in 1925, we were set up then, and initially, and actually what was an incredibly forward-thinking move at the time, the Dickens Fellowship purchased at auction the two houses together. They'd been running one as a hotel and one as a boarding house. They bought them together with the express purpose of establishing a museum in 48 in Dickens's house, but continuing to rent out number 49 to endow the museum. So it was incredible, and that established us as a truly independent entity, which we remain today. We don't rely on any ongoing public subsidy as many museums here in the UK do, and we're fiercely proud of our independence and the very forward-thinking move that established us in that way.
Well, it's a fascinating story, and fascinating how forward-thinking the organization was that long ago. Why don't we take a quick break here, and then when we come back, we'll talk about engaging beyond Christmas with Dickens and telling the full story and what's next for the museum, particularly beyond COVID. And we'll do that right here on PreserveCast. Hey, it's Nick here, and I want to remind you briefly that your support is what makes this podcast possible. To keep hearing important stories like this one, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and follow along on social media at PreserveCast. You can also continue supporting the podcast with a donation at PreserveCast.org. PreserveCast is sponsored by the 1772 Foundation and powered by Preservation Maryland, a nonprofit organization that believes we all succeed when we all know more about our past. This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast. On this episode of PreserveCast, we're talking about all things Charles Dickens with Dr. Cindy Sughrue of the Charles Dickens Museum. And before we took our break, we were talking about how the museum was established, and the stories that they tell. So I'm curious, is it hard to engage beyond Christmas? Is that the focus? And how do you get people interested in Dickens' larger story at the museum?
Well, you'd think that it would be hard to move beyond Christmas because Dickens is so quintessentially associated with the festive season. But it's really incredibly easy. And it's easy for two reasons. One is that Dickens was interested in everything. He wasn't just a writer working away in isolation in his study at home. He was interested in everything that was happening during what has to be one of the most dynamic periods of history, during the Victorian period. So he was interested in technological development, in artistic development, in what was happening in medicine and science, everything that was going on, he was fascinated and driven by. So because he had such wide-ranging interests, there's just about every topic we could explore. And the other aspect is our collection. Our collection officially numbers over 100,000 items. We're going through a painstaking process of cataloguing everything, and we suspect we have closer to 200,000 or more items. And this is everything from letters and manuscripts, as you'd expect, to furniture, personal effects, the only clothing of Dickens known to survive, artworks, photographs. It's an incredibly rich and three-dimensional collection. And with that, we can draw out different types of museum displays, but also there's an incredible rich body of research material that has yet to be fully explored and drawn out. So with both Dickens as a character in his own interests in the world and what we have in terms of this incredible collection, we have no end of special exhibitions or evolutions we can make to our permanent displays in the museum.
So it's interesting, talking about all the different stories that you can tell about Dickens and sort of like Christmas is the gateway, but there's so many different ways of talking about it and his intersection with so many different aspects of mid-19th century life. There's also the more challenging side of 19th century life. And here in the U.S., there's this really renewed focus on telling the full story of various historical figures, historic sites, and that means the good and the bad. What does that look like for Charles Dickens? How do you tell the full story? Is there a side to Dickens that maybe perhaps we're not as proud of, or is more challenging to talk about? How do you approach that? And is that something that you guys are thinking about?
Yes, absolutely. For the past 7 years or so, we've been consciously working to present as rounded a picture as possible of Charles Dickens, both through evolving our permanent displays and through special exhibitions. We've also been growing our range of digital content, so putting our collection online and developing more subject-focused material that sits on our website and related sites. But it's interesting because Dickens wasn't a saint, but he's also a character whose life has been picked over in such detail in a way that I can't think of any other artist or writer. And I think that's because there's so much of Dickens that still exists in the world, not only our collection because of its sheer size and breadth, but in many other institutions as well that have letters. There's known to be at least 16,000 letters that exist. And that draws out very different aspects of Dickens. A personal letter to a friend or associate is never meant to be picked over by, the general public. Every aspect of Dickens has been examined in a great amount of detail. And that's not any way of trying to rationalize anything else we might say in this conversation, but it's also the fact that Dickens has been picked over in such detail that there's almost every single subject that you could have different sides of or types of perspective on. But one of the more challenging aspects that has been talked about quite a lot is how he treated his wife, Catherine, when they separated. And it was, he was in his 40s. They'd been married for 20 odd years. They'd had many, many happy years together. And as Dickens became more driven, and not only was he continuing to write fiction, he was by that stage starting to do public performances of his work. He was engaged in a whole raft of charitable philanthropic projects as well. As he became more and more driven, he almost manic, and I use that word intentionally. Catherine just couldn't keep up with him. And, as relationships do, they fall apart. And he fell out of love with her. And, they'd been struggling for a few years when he met a young actress and fell very much in love with her. So this is a story that we've drawn that out both in changing our permanent displays to give Catherine more of a voice, but also through special exhibitions. And what was really interesting, at the time that they separated, they never divorced. They separated. Dickens did this very publicly, and he wanted to maintain his reputation, which was vital to his income, and indeed the income that supported a very large family by this time. But he became very concerned that if his reputation was in any way tarnished, suddenly not only his celebrity, but his income would deteriorate rapidly. But he cast Catherine as somehow being at fault, because everyone will say, if a relationship breaks down, who's at fault? And Dickens could not allow himself to be seen in any way at fault. So he painted Catherine in that way, and she almost became airbrushed out of the records after that, and was really important for us as a museum because she was an extraordinary, talented and driven, popular woman. And so we worked hard to bring her and her voice very solidly into the museum because it was their home. And she was such an important part, not just of the home here, but of Dickens and his career, facilitating him as he established his career and jettisoned into stardom. And I think when people come and visit the museum, we want them to know, as much as we can, the truth about their relationship, how wonderful and loving it was, and indeed how it broke down, what happened after that. But we try to separate Dickens the man and his failings from Dickens the writer and the artist and the social reform campaigner and all these things that were good and wonderful about Dickens. And I think if we don't separate those things out, and we failed as a museum, I think we can appreciate art and all the good that can come from that, at the same time as recognizing that the artist is human and has their own failings. Another thing that we've been really conscious of doing is drawing out some of the trickier aspects of what Dickens thought. So he didn't, like I hope most of us, don't have fixed views that can never change over time. And Dickens often changed his views on different matters. But he had very complex views on race. So while he argued passionately and persuasively for the abolition of slavery, he also believed in racial hierarchy, as many people did at the time. So that while Black people shouldn't, indeed no one should ever be enslaved, Dickens, he believed that they needed to be managed, guided, controlled almost in the way that children do, because there's that sense that they were not as intellectually capable or as civilized is often the term that's used. So it's really interesting when we explore some of these issues around Dickens and race. One thing that we're doing at the moment, we have a special exhibition on about Oliver Twist and looking at the many aspects of that story. We also have drawn out Dickens's anti-Semitic portrayal of Fagin. And there's a really rather wonderful story of how Dickens was just completely unaware of the long-standing racial archetype that he was drawing on to portray the character of Fagin. And it was pointed out to him by a woman called Eliza Davis, who was Jewish. And this was nearly 30 years after Oliver Twist was written. It was still really popular and was constantly being, reprinted and new editions coming out. And she happened to know Dickens socially. And she wrote to him to say, I don't know if you realize, you're this wonderful champion of the rights of people and fighting against injustice. But do you realize you have done a great injustice to me and my people? And she pointed out how damaging that portrayal of Fagin had continued to be for Jewish people who did not enjoy equal rights or status within society at the time. And over a series of 3 years, she wrote to Dickens, and eventually he saw her point, and she wrote very, very persuasively. And he did a number of things as a result of that. He changed the way Fagin was described in the next edition of Oliver Twist that came out. So instead of him being relentlessly referred to as the Jew, Dickens changed that. He also introduced a very sympathetic Jewish character into the novel he was writing at the time, Our Mutual Friend, so Mr. Rhea. And most people will think, who was Mr. Rhea? He wasn't one of the leading characters, but he was an important one. And he was drawn out in a way to present a much more favorable impression of a Jewish person. And Dickens also started, as he did in so many areas, to give to Jewish causes, to help champion the cause of Jewish people and support that through philanthropic endeavor. So, he was someone who demonstrated that he could have his mind changed and he would do whatever he could to make amends. And I think that's really important, because when we talk about writers or artists from the past, they were in a particular period of time and there's a context there, but they're also not here today to have enjoyed the same experiences and opportunities of thought and engagement as we have. So I'm always really careful that we shouldn't throw a 21st century lens on a 19th century writer, but however, we need to responsibly as a museum draw out difficult issues and material and discuss them. And I think people would expect no less from a museum.
So speaking of difficult issues, I'm sure COVID, like every museum, has been a hell of a ride. But where are you headed? What's the hope? I mean, I know we all sort of felt like we were about to come out of this, and I know in the UK right now, Omicron is skyrocketing. But where do you hope to be, and what are you looking at, sort of post-pandemic, as where the museum is headed?
Well, we have a significant milestone on the horizon. 2025 will be the museum's centenary. So we're currently putting plans in place to mark that in a number of ways. But thinking about the immediate future, our next special exhibition in 2022 will celebrate the Pickwick Papers, Dickens's first novel. So he was obviously finishing writing that here in Doughty Street. And then later in 2022, we'll be exploring the very many ghosts in Dickens. Everyone's familiar with the ghosts in A Christmas Carol, but ghosts appear in a lot of Dickens's writings, from his very early short stories, and indeed this in Pickwick Papers, there's a very fascinating ghost story in there, and right through to later life and his final writings. Ghosts, appear as a way to, I suppose, be both a guide and a challenger for those of us in the non-spiritual world. So we're going to be looking at the very many aspects of ghosts that appear in his work.
It's exciting and sort of an interesting take on Dickens, which I know is part and parcel of your work. I mean, that's trying to reinvent and tell interesting stories about somebody that a lot of people feel like they know, but obviously, given this conversation, not everybody knows them, and there's a lot more to learn, which is a good reason to go and visit. And hopefully, as the world opens back up, whenever that happens, we'll be able to get out there and come and see amazing places like this. A couple of quick hits before we leave. Do you have a favorite quote from A Christmas Carol?
There are so many wonderful lines. From the very first, Marley was dead. To begin with, there was no doubt whatever about that. I just love that. What a great opening. It grips you straight away. But also the first description of Scrooge I like, and it's a longer one, so I'll just have to refer to it here. So the first description of Scrooge, it's just fantastic. He was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. And it's just great, isn't it? You've got all those wonderful words. It just conjures up. But if I were forced to choose, I think it would have to be that penultimate paragraph when Scrooge has been transformed, and he's just promised to increase Bob Cratchit's salary and to help his struggling family. And this paragraph, I think, just really brings the carol to a close. Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world.
So beautiful. So well done. What a gift Dickens gave the world in that. And it's... almost as synonymous now with Christmas as the Christmas story from the Bible. I mean, let's be honest. I think some people, it's just as synonymous with Christmas, and tells, an equally important story about human nature and how to treat each other.
I think you're right. And, I think what's also glorious about Christmas Carol is that it does have a spiritual message to it, but it's a very secular story. So I think it's something that can cut across religious and social and cultural divides. And I think, it has that spirituality, that sense of, and Dickens was Christian. It has a Christian good at the foundation, but it doesn't have a message that would in any way divide people across religious boundaries.
Before we go, we ask this of everyone, and you don't have to say the Charles Dickens Museum, but what is your favorite historic site?
Gosh, how to choose? Well, here in Britain, I think it would be a toss-up between St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and also the various Roman sites that we have right in the city of London. Is the Roman bathhouse at Billingsgate and the Roman fort and amphitheatre remains, again, right in the heart of the city, the old city of London. There's a temple of Mithras as well. So you've got that sense of the Roman foundations of London or Londinium, and then this beautiful Christopher Wren designed St. Paul's Cathedral sitting on top of it virtually. But if I could look back to my homeland of America, I think I would have to choose the home of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's beautifully preserved and presented, but it also has Dickens connections. Dickens met Longfellow on Dickens's first trip to America in 1842. So 1842, so that was 1 year before he wrote A Christmas Carol. And they became really close friends. Dickens hosted Longfellow here in London when he visited a year or two later. And Dickens then went back to visit him on Dickens's second and final trip to America in 1867. Dickens spent Thanksgiving 1867 with Longfellow in that house. So I like that sort of Dickens-Longfellow connection. So I think if I had to choose one, I would gravitate back to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the Longfellow house.
Well, fantastic answer and a great way to end a really fun and interesting interview. And again, as people get back out traveling, hopefully listeners both overseas and here in the States will put you high on their list. You've done a great sales job for the stories that you tell and the significance of Dickens. And I appreciate you having you on from the good old city.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to PreserveCast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.